The account of the crucifixion is no doubt a unique portion of our Bibles, isn't it? For a variety of different reasons. And we think about the crucifixion, all of us, on a weekly basis, don't we? We, to some extent or another, we picture Christ upon the cross, or we think about his death. It's something that is quite regular for us. And so it's good for us to think, to spend a bit of time this evening thinking about some of the details that are presented to us and the things that we are told and the things that we're not told and why that might be the case. But one of the reasons that this passage is unique is because we have a lot of information about it, don't we? We have 4 long chapters in Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, which all deal with only a few hours of one man's life. And there isn't any other passage of scripture which is so rich, is there, that is so focused. There's nothing that we get so much material on so few hours. And despite this richness, though, what is perhaps interesting about what we are told is that there is a contrast to an extent between what has happened before Christ is crucified and then the way that Christ is presented in the text when he is crucified. And part of that is, a lot of that is just to do with the scenario that before his crucifixion, Christ was directing or being directed by the Spirit what he was doing and who he was interacting with. And therefore, a lot of the text prior to these 4 chapters is to do with Christ meeting someone or initiating conversations with individuals or deciding to go to a particular town or a place and for a particular purpose. And there are, of course, other occasions where people kind of take the initiative in their interactions with Christ, but he initiates a lot of the conversations, and he also there is a lot of the things that he says. And again, that's because it's a very different scenario, isn't it? Christ is there preaching and teaching, and he isn't doing that in these chapters. But it's still perhaps interesting that we have so few things that Christ says, and yet we get such long chapters. And what we do have, though, are lots of different individuals and groups of people that interact with Christ. And those interactions with Christ are almost seem to be what the purpose of the way in which these chapters are presented to us. One of the things that we are being told, we're not told, other than what we are told that Christ said, if there's anything else that he said upon the cross, it isn't full of his dialogue with any individuals. We are told, however, of the different interactions that Christ has. And therefore, perhaps one of the things that we are to take when we look or to consider when we read through these chapters is the way in which these different groups interact with and respond to, and what their understanding of Christ is. And therefore, it begs the question, doesn't it, for us, what our response is. And that's really the exhortation that we want to kind of just mention at the beginning and we'll mention at the end as well. What is our response in observing and thinking about these things, in thinking about who and what kind of a man Christ was? What does it reveal about our own interactions? So just to summarize the things that Christ says, he quotes a passage, or he has a very brief interaction that's recorded with a group of people that are lamenting and wailing after him. And he quotes some passages of scriptures that we'll look at in a moment. As he's crucified, he asks God to forgive him. He responds with a single sentence to the thieves on the cross. He says he has that interaction with his own mother, which we have recorded. What he says is very brief, isn't it? Woman, behold thy son, and son, behold thy mother. He cries out some of the words of Psalm 22. He says, I thirst. He says, it is finished. He says, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. And that's all we have recorded that Christ says. And there may, of course, be practical reasons, several practical reasons. One, like we've said, the scenario that he's on the cross, and that we're told in Luke that a lot of individuals are separate from him and are standing afar off. And also the practical reason is because he's being crucified, and we know that the form of that execution is to suffocate the individual, and it's not as if he's going to be talking if he had opportunity to say things. But again, it also places an emphasis on the people that he's interacting with before he's physically crucified, and then when he is, and afterwards. And what's kind of finally interesting before we look at some of these examples is that there is a very matter-of-fact way in which the Gospels present Christ's crucifixion to us, particularly the actual physical crucifixion. When we look at John's Gospel, for instance, the verse, and it's not just John's Gospel, which mentions the fact that Christ was crucified, the crucifixion itself, the physical nailing of Christ to the cross, isn't the primary subject of the verse. It's other things, and we'll look at that in a moment. So the fact that Christ is crucified, even though we know that that is such a powerful symbol that takes us all the way back to time of Moses and beyond and into Genesis, and kind of perpetuates throughout our scriptures the symbol of the cross. And as that the symbol of the cross was important in Christ's own doctrine to the disciples as he's lifted up and drawn many to him, and various other passages, the physical description of the crucifixion is passed over in the narrative almost incidentally, because it isn't really the thing, in some ways, that we are being told about. It's the people that Christ interacted with, or how they perceived Christ, is what the record is telling us all about. So let's look at some of those examples. If you just turn to Matthew chapter 27, kind of ends the period of the trial in Matthew chapter 27 and verse 31, where we read that after they had mocked him, so the soldiers take him and mock him and take the robe off him, and they put his own raiment on him. So they've had their fun, as it were, with him in the hall of judgment. They then led Christ away to crucify him. And if you just keep a finger in Matthew chapter 27 and turn back to Isaiah chapter 53, we see that this specific event of him being led out of the halls of judgment in the north of Jerusalem around to Golgotha, where he is crucified, this is the leading of Christ, seems to appear in Isaiah 53 in quite a precise way. So from verse 7 through to verse 9, the language is chronological, or it seems to be chronological. So from verse 7, Christ is oppressed and he is afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth, which is something in particular which is there in the trial, isn't it, when he refuses to speak. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. Then he is taken from prison and from judgment, and he's literally taken from the halls of judgment, isn't he, around to crucifixion. And then we read in verse 8, who shall declare his generation? For he was cut off out of the land of the living. For the transgressions of my people was he stricken, and then he made his grave with the wicked. So we seem in these couple of verses to have, quite a precise account of the journey that Christ makes from the trial, led from judgment and from prison to where he is crucified. And what that does is it emphasizes to us the idea of Christ being led. He is taken from prison and from judgment. And we go back into Matthew's gospel and we look at how this word led him away to crucify him is used, and a variety of others. We see actually there is a real emphasis on the fact that Christ is being led here, and he by a variety of different people. So there is a couple of different words which are used, but most of this word which is used, and I haven't written down the Greek, are to do with the crucifixion or the events that just precede it. So there is an occasion that's used in Matthew chapter 7, which talks about the way that leadeth to life or death in Matthew chapter 7, verse 13. But other than that, we have Matthew chapter 27, verse 2, that when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered Christ to Pontius Pilate, the governor. And then in Mark's gospel, we have the account of where Judas in Mark chapter 14, verse 44, says, after he'd betrayed Christ, he gives him a token saying, whomsoever I shall kiss, that same is he, take him and lead him away safely. And then later in the chapter, in verse 53, we read that Christ was led to the high priest. And then he's led to the praetorium where the soldiers mock him. In Luke chapter 23, he is led away. In John chapter 18 and verse 13, he's led to Annas first. And later in John chapter 19, we read that they take Jesus in John chapter 19 and verse 16. So you find these in a concordance, but they take Jesus and they lead him. So the idea of Christ being led from the point that he's taken by Judas to Annas, to Pilate, to crucifixion is a feature of these gospel records. There is then a second word which is used in John chapter 19 and verse 16, which is about taking Jesus. So we'll just turn to that one. If we go to John chapter 19 and verse 16, then delivered he him therefore unto them to be crucified, and they took Jesus and led him away. So they take him and they lead him, and that is the idea of receiving him. And then they take him to Golgotha. And then finally, there is another word if we go to Mark's gospel, and the word for led that we've looked at in all of those occasions doesn't seem to have any particular connotation other than the English for led, as far as I understand it. But in Mark chapter 15 and verse 20, where we read that they led him out to crucify him, there is more of a kind of a gentler connotation, or there is a particular kind of gentleness about this. When you look at the other uses of this word in Scripture, it kind of backs this up. So it's where they take the blind man by the hand. Christ leads the disciples to Bethany. It's the way in which sheep are led in John chapter 10. And then in Acts and Hebrews, it talks about God taking and leading the children of Israel out of Egypt. So the fact that Christ is here and that he is being done to is something that this word picks up for us. And we know that that's the case. We've just looked at Isaiah 53, haven't we, where Christ is presented as the sheep. And he's very much, that metaphor continues as he's led from one place into before one group and another group. And eventually he's led to his crucifixion. What is interesting is that there is then the first individual that he interacts with as he's being led is Simon of Cyrene. And the way that Simon of Cyrene is taken is very different to Christ, because Christ is being led and he's allowing himself to be led, whereas the language around Simon of Cyrene and how he has found himself in this particular position of being forced to take the cross of Christ is the opposite. So Matthew and Mark use the idea of conscription, that he is compelled to pick up the cross. And Luke uses the language that it says they catch Simon and then they impose the cross on him. And that language is the same as imposing the crown of thorns upon Christ's head. And so you get this contrast then between the way that Christ is here And he's being led, and he's allowing this to happen to him, or he's not resisting this. And then Simon of Cyrene, who's much more forcible in the way in which he's been plucked out and taken and thrust into this position. And yet there is an irony in this, isn't there? Because Christ is not really being led, as we just read, where it spoke about Pilate could have no power except it were given to him. The reality is that Christ is deliberately here, isn't it? That he knew that his hour was coming from the right at the beginning of his ministry, and before this, there was a time to come where he was going to have to offer himself. And what we have here is, from the perspective of the scribes and the Pharisees and the Romans, they are in control. But of course, that isn't really the case. Christ is allowing himself to be taken here, and he is offering himself, and this is a willing and deliberate thing and position that Christ finds himself in at this precise moment, having engineered, and the angels having engineered this particular point. And Simon then stands as this antitypal kind of disciple, doesn't he? Because he's literally, as Christ said, take up your cross and follow me. And here is Simon, who isn't there willingly, but he's there because he's been conscripted into this position to literally fulfill the metaphor of a disciple carrying Christ's cross for him. But he isn't really properly following Christ in the way that a disciple is called to make a decision to deny themselves and to take up Christ's cross and to follow him. And so this first interaction is fascinating, isn't it, in the contrast between the way in which Christ is presented here and the way that Simon is presented, the details that we see about Simon and the way that we're told about who he is and where he comes from. And one of the things that it seems to be telling us is about the proper function of a disciple, the proper calling of a disciple, and also the way in which Christ here is offering himself and giving his life. Now, the second interaction, if we just turn to Luke's Gospel and chapter 23. Luke chapter 23 and verse 27. And there followed Jesus a great company of people and of women, which also bewailed and lamented him. But Jesus, turning unto them, said, Daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming in the which they shall say, Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bear and the paps which never gave suck. Then shall they begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, Cover us. For if they do these things in a green tree, what shall be done in the dry? And here, this interaction, there is nothing, I don't think, to suggest that the wailing and lamenting in verse 27 isn't anything other than genuine. It is the same language as those that mourn the girl that dies and that Christ says, why are you weeping? She's not dead but sleeps. But there is this group of people, this company of people which are following Christ, particularly of women, which are bewailing and lamenting him. And Christ responds by pointing out to them the consequence of what's about to happen to him for them. And this second kind of interaction then shows us Christ's concern for Israel and his appreciation of what it meant for them to take the air and to crucify him. And he quotes a couple of different passages here. So first of all, he says something, he says in verse 29, Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bear and the paps which never gave suck, which is something which he said very similar words earlier in the gospel in Matthew chapter 24, when he's talking about the AD 70 and that event which is to come. So he says it in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 19. Woe unto them which are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. Pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world, to this time, no, nor ever shall be. So he talks about that event there, and he uses the same language in verse 29. But then in verse 30, he seems to quote from Hosea chapter 10. So you keep a finger in Luke chapter 23, and you go back to Hosea. And it's here in chapter 10 that we have, in the prophecy that Hosea is recording, is this description of the realization that Israel has of the way in which they called for and wanted a king, and that then a king is going to be purposeless for them when they are conquered by the Assyrians. So verse 3 of chapter 10, for now they shall say, we have no king, because we feared not Yahweh. What then should a king do to us? They have spoken words, swearing falsely and making a covenant. Thus judgment springeth up as hemlock in the furrows of the field. And then from verse 8, the high places also of Avon and the sin of Israel shall be destroyed. The thorn and the thistle shall come up on their altars, and they shall say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. O Israel, thou hast sinned from the days of Gibeah. There they stood. The battle in Gibeah against the children of iniquity did not overtake them. So I think that this is where Christ is quoting from, and this is the image of those that have been overcome by the Assyrian invasion and that really just want to die because their predicament has become so terrible. And this then is what is in Christ's mind when he looks on these women that are wailing and weeping and says, my concern isn't for myself. It's, or your concern, I suppose is what he actually says, it should be for you and for your children. And then the second quotation seems to be from Ezekiel chapter 17. So he says, for if they do these things in a green tree, what shall be done in the dry? And so in Ezekiel chapter 17, we have, if we just turn back there, the account of the fall of Judah. And it describes that kind of the end of that period of the kings. And all the trees of the field shall know that I, Yahweh, have brought down the high tree, have exalted the low tree, have dried up the green tree, and have made the dry tree to flourish. And if we just turn forwards to Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 47, we get similar language. And to describe the Judah being destroyed by a fire. And it says that every green tree in thee, in verse 47, and every dry tree, the flaming flame shall not be quenched, and all faces from the south to the north shall be burned therein. Talking about the judgment that's going to come on Judah. And in the Hebrew Bible, from verse 45 of chapter 20 all the way through to the end of chapter 21, it's one single chapter. And it seems that the beginning verses of chapter 21 then are kind of an expansion of this parable, or an explanation of this parable. And therefore the idea of the righteous and the wicked in verse 3 corresponds to the idea of the green and the dry types of trees which are going to be consumed. And this resonates then with what Christ is effectively saying in verse 31 of Luke chapter 23, where he says, if they do these things in a green tree, what shall be done in the dry, which is presumably referring to the crucifixion in the time of Christ's presence in righteousness, and then the consequence for this, the punishments for this that will come in AD 70. So Christ makes these allusions then, which in this second interaction clearly roots us back into what is in Christ's mind as he's being led, which is his understanding of what God is going to bring in terms of the punishments. And that's interesting, isn't it? Because it isn't nothing for Christ to be thinking these things. This is dreadful, isn't it, for this man? It's one of the great burdens as he calls for those that crucify him to be forgiven. It's one of the great things that he was having to wrestle with, wasn't it? His understanding of what this was going to mean for these individuals, the women that he could see, and the children, that generation that were going to be so slaughtered by the Romans. And that is just another thing that Christ was having to deal with and to think about and to process as he is bearing the sins of us all at this point. And finally, though, there is in the language that Christ uses here, perhaps a further kind of allusion back, or certainly there's a picture that takes us back to the prophecy of Jeremiah in chapter 9. Because this is a picture, isn't it, of the daughters of Jerusalem who are lamenting. And Jeremiah chapter 9 is interesting because it picks up on some of this language or some of these images, and in particularly in verse 20 of Jeremiah chapter 9 we read, "Yet hear the word of Yahweh, O ye women, and let your ear receive the word of his mouth, and teach your daughters wailing, and everyone her neighbour lamentation. For death is come up into our windows, and is entered into our palaces, to cut off the children from without, and the young men from the streets." And here Jeremiah again is talking about the destruction from Babylon, but it goes on in verse 23 and 24 before it then kind of goes on to continue to talk about the kind of the punishment, to have this little phrase which is, "Thus saith Yahweh, let not the wise man glory in his wisdom, neither let the mighty man glory in his might, let not the rich man glory in his riches, but let him that glorieth glory in this, that he understandeth and knoweth me, that I am Yahweh, which exercise loving kindness, judgment, and righteousness in the earth. For in these things I delight, saith Yahweh." And why this is particularly interesting is because it's quoted in Corinthians to talk about the crucifixion of the Lord Jesus Christ. And so we've got the image in Luke chapter 23 of these women who are mirroring the image of the wailing of the women back in Babylonian times. And we've got this phrase then of, what would have saved them, or what would have saved those that endured throughout this period, is the focus upon understanding and knowing and believing in God's wisdom and glorying in him. And not in, their own strength, as it were. And that here then, this is the glory of God. And again, there is this profound irony, isn't there, in the way in which the glory of God is revealed, the wisdom of God, in his wisdom, in this man who's bent over, who's so weak that he's unable to carry his cross, who's walking on the way to be killed, and this is the event which is going to save mankind. So here then is brought out to us in this picture and this interaction with these women, this crowd that was following Christ. This language which takes us back to some of the passages which tell us about how history is repeating itself, and history is repeating itself in that God is the source of salvation, and here is God's salvation for them to see. So let's move on let's turn now to John's Gospel in chapter 19. because we read together, didn't we, some of the interaction that Pilate had with Christ and then with the Jews. And it seems as if when the Pilate almost features in these interactions to present Christ as a king. He obviously talks to Christ about him being a king, and he talks to the high priest about Christ's kingship. And in his interaction with the Jews, it leads them to declare, to almost nail their colours to the mast and to say, we have no king but Caesar. So it forces them in their interaction to kind of manipulate the situation or the accusations that they're making against Christ to say the reason that he should be killed is because he is standing in the place of Caesar. And actually, we have our allegiance to Caesar, which is one of the things that they were trying to accuse and to kind of trip Christ up with. So it does this. And then ultimately it leads to Christ, to Pilate, presenting to everyone this sign, which very clearly says that Jesus of Nazareth is the King of the Jews. To which the chief priests and the Jews respond, and they say, "Don't write that he is the King of the Jews, but that he said, 'I am the King of the Jews.'" And why would you have that interaction were it not to present the fact that Pilate has actually shown us the truth, hasn't he? He's actually demonstrated to everyone there that Jesus really is the King of the Jews. But of course, it isn't Pilate that physically does this, is it? It's the next group of people that have an interaction with Christ, which is the Roman soldiers. And they're there in verse 18, where that they are crucifying him, two other with him on either side, one, and Jesus in the midst. But if we just go down to verse 23, this is then one of the key verses which helps us understand how the soldiers understood and saw Christ, where we read, "Then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his garments and made 4 parts." And this is one of the verses where the crucifixion of Christ is so incidental, isn't it, in the verse. The soldiers, this verse is really about what the soldiers are doing to Christ, in that they're taking his garments and making 4 parts, to every soldier a part, and also his coat. The coat is without seam, woven from the top throughout. So for the soldiers, this is such a kind of a procedural event in their lives, wasn't it? It's just another crucifixion, and they're so dehumanized, and they're so used to doing this, to this horrific method of crucifixion, of execution, crucifixion, that it's incidental to them that they are crucifying Christ. And so when they crucify Christ, then as part of this, they're actually the ones that nail up this placard and present Christ as the King of the Jews. And yet they are, of all of these people interacting with Christ, those who almost don't even see him as a person, let alone as the King of the Jews. And there is another irony, isn't there, in how far they are from their understanding of what they are doing and who they are doing this to. But it isn't just the fact that they're presenting Christ as a king, because this whole episode in verse 23 and 24, where they take his garments and they divide it, but his coat they don't divide because it is without seam, woven from the top throughout. That takes us back, doesn't it, if we just keep a finger in John chapter 19 and go back to Exodus chapter 28. It reminds us, doesn't it, of the garments of the high priest. Exodus chapter 28 and verse 32, where we read from verse 31, "Thou shalt make the robe of the ephod all of blue, and there shall be an hole in the top of it, in the midst thereof. It shall have a binding of woven work round about the whole of it, as it were the whole of an harpagion, that it be not rent." And here then is Christ with a very similar garment fulfilling a prophecy, which is that they parted his raiment and cast lots, but that they don't rend this particular garment. And so the other kind of presentation of Christ here that the soldiers are unwittingly doing is presenting him as a priest, as the high priest. And so we've got the most ignorant group, who are the ones that crucify Christ, who are actually showing to the world around him, or to presenting for us as readers, that here is the king priest of the Jews. The next interaction that we read is a very different one, isn't it? And is at the opposite end of the scale, because it's in verse 25 and 26 and 27, when in this very emotional, really, and very kind of sensitive scene, we have Christ's mother standing before him and seeing him crucified. So we read in verse 25, having read earlier in Luke chapter 23 that most people stood afar off, but here clearly Mary and Mary Magdalene and Mary, the wife of Cleopas, and the disciple whom John loved are close enough for Christ to interact with them. So there is this group that have split off from the other disciples who are observing from a distance. And verse 25, they are standing by the cross of Jesus. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple standing by, verse 26, whom he loved, he saith unto his mother, Woman, behold thy son. Then saith he to the disciple, Behold thy mother. And from that hour that disciple took her unto his own home. And here then, it's completely a coincidence that as I understand them, the signs of John, that actually the crucifixion, I think, is presented as one of the signs of John, and that these signs of John are chiastic and are relate to one another. The first sign of John then corresponds with this, which is, I think, the last sign of John. And it's interesting that he has an interaction with his mother in the first sign of John, in John chapter 2, which is the water into wine. And again, I say, definitely one just to think about and to look at. But in John chapter 2 and verse 4, Jesus says unto his mother, Woman, what have I to do with thee? Mine hour is not yet come. And the Greek here is, woman, I believe it is, woman, what have thee and me to do, or something like that. And I think it's in the ESV, it presents it as, this event has nothing to do with me and you, rather than Christ speaking directly and saying, what do you have to do with me? But actually, when you look at that phrase and how else it's used, it does seem to be individuals which are talking about Christ. So it would suggest that Christ is saying this to his mother and saying, Woman, what have I to do with thee? Mine hour is not yet come. And the idea of him saying the hour is not yet come implies that, well, we know what the hour in John's gospel is all about. It's the moment of crucifixion. So Christ is saying to Mary at this point, his mother, whatever's happening with this water into wine, and we have, the symbolism of this wine being, created and what we kind of understand by that. He's saying, now is not the time for this kind of a miracle, for a miracle which turns water into wine. However, Mary would understand that. Clearly, she's not kind of deterred, because she says in verse 5, his mother saith unto the servants, whatsoever he saith unto you, do it. But there's something, isn't there, about the way Christ has made a point here. And he's made a point which is about his crucifixion. And now his hour has come, and he has another very rare interaction at the point of crucifixion with his mother. And that's interesting. And the interaction that he has is, it seems to be that he is drawing the disciple and Mary together to be looked after, that his mother is to be looked after by the disciple that Jesus loved, presumably by John. And some suggest that actually when Christ says, "Woman, behold thy son," he is talking about himself. And that might be the case, but they certainly come as a parallel, don't they? And it's certainly in verse 26 introduced. He only says this when he sees the disciple that he loves standing there. He says, "Woman, behold thy son." And he says to the disciple, "Behold thy mother." And from that hour they come together. So it does seem to read as if the point of what Christ is saying is to draw them together. Now, why does Christ say this? Well, I guess there is a kind of, in the same way that we looked at earlier, the way in which Christ is concerned for the women that are wailing in that generation. He is a man who is full of love, isn't he? And his mother is here. And we read back in Luke chapter 2 that a sword is going to pierce through Mary's heart. And, this is surely the time, as a mother looks upon her son, that her heart is being pierced. And so it's appropriate, isn't it, for Christ to offer a support for her at this point. And perhaps that is the main purpose of what we're being told and what is happening in this interaction. But this is what happens. And kind of another just thought is that some of this language, because it says directly after this verse in verse 28, after this, Jesus, knowing that all things were now accomplished, that the scripture might be fulfilled. Well, some of that language is very similar to what we read in John chapter 13 and verse 1. And John chapter 13 and verse 1, kind of understanding of the way in which we're to read the Greek at the end of that verse. So it says, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour was come and that he should depart out of the world unto the Father, as kind of a break, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them unto the end. And there's a couple of ways that this word teleo, I think it is, can be translated. And one of them is that he loved them utterly or to the utmost. So this kind of complete love, which is to be demonstrated at this moment. But actually, when you do look at that word, it does seem to more often than not, almost exclusively, be about the time of the end, i.e. he loves them up to the point and up until a particular, like the end of the age, as it were. And that does make sense in some ways, because it says he loved his own which were in the world. And he goes on in John chapter 70 to talk about those that are not in the world in the way that he's not in the world. So this might be a complete misapplication of this verse to something like John chapter 19, and the point that I'm kind of what I'm suggesting just for thought is that this is an example of how Christ, in a practical way, shows love for his disciples and particularly for his mother. And I think whether or not John chapter 13 and verse 1 is actually, this is a direct example of right up until the end of his life, until the things were accomplished to the end, which is, I think, pretty much the same word. When all things are accomplished, then when his mother is kind of, as it were, and John sorted out, then the kind of his thoughts and things become slightly more insular. Regardless of whether John 13 and verse 1 does apply. Here is an act, isn't it, of love and of selflessness that is throughout Christ's life. So here is then a very different interaction, isn't it? A very intimate and loving and personal interaction that Christ has with his mother and his mother with him, who would have known him in a way that no other person knew him, in the way that she had been exposed to him as a boy growing up. And it's very emotive little section, isn't it? So then there are then, of course, other interactions, but our kind of time has run out. So there are the scribes and the Pharisees, and it's very interesting. We have lots of examples, don't we, in our scriptures of the way in which the scribes and the Pharisees constantly interact with Christ and he criticizes them and ask him difficult questions. Here, he says nothing to them, and yet what they say to him are kind of quite profound, insightful things in a way. They're saying that he isn't all of these things, but they are saying things like, save thyself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross. If you are the King of Israel, come down from the cross. He saved others, himself he cannot save. Let God deliver him now, if he will have him. Let Christ, the King of Israel, descend from the cross. It's kind of... they're saying absolutely the things that could be possible, aren't they? And that absolutely are true, and they don't believe it. But and again, there is an irony there, and there is this the silence of Christ, who is the King, who God did want to deliver, who is the Son of God here, and the scribes and Pharisees who are instrumental in bringing Israel and their own the belief in their own reign to an end in this act. We have the two thieves then, don't we, on the cross, and the very different understanding and perception and the way that they kind of treat Christ. And then finally, we have kind of Christ's interaction, as it were, and we just touch on it in kind of 30 seconds or so, where he makes a prayer, or quotes, doesn't he, from Psalm 22, and says, "Why have you forsaken me?" And there has been lots of different views on why Christ says this, and perhaps part of why he says it is, as it's been suggested, that Christ no longer has the same level of interaction at this moment in the way that he did with God throughout his ministry, in the way that his ear was opened, in the way that he could speak to God in a way that was kind of exclusive to him, and that here Christ upon the cross has to face these last moments without any kind of suggestion that he is supported by God, as he crucifies, defeats sin in the flesh. But there is also just kind of the reading of Psalm 22 is a psalm, isn't it, if we just turn back to it, which is clearly talking about this event, but presents a person, an individual who is searching for a reliance upon God and finding it, isn't he? And it's someone that's kind of wrestling with a scenario which is clearly traumatic, but is constantly reinforcing the fact to himself that he is going to be okay. So, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why art thou so far from helping me and from the words of my roaring? O my God, I cry in the daytime, but thou hearest not, and in the night season, and are not silent. But thou art holy, O thou that inhabitest the praises of Israel. Our fathers trusted in him. They trusted, and thou didst deliver them. They cried unto thee, and were delivered. They trusted in thee, and were not confounded. But I am a worm and a man, a reproach of men and despised of the people. They that see me laugh me to scorn. They shoot out the lip, they shake the head, saying, he trusted on Yahweh that he would deliver him. Let him deliver him, seeing he delighted in him. But thou art he that took me out of the womb. Thou didst make me hope when I was upon my mother's breasts. And it continues, doesn't it? Even in this first half of the psalm, it's a person that is feeling this trauma, and it's Christ, isn't it, who's, as this kind of terrible event culminates, and we've said, as the Gospels are portrayed, we get this kind of very matter-of-fact way in which the crucifixion is presented to us, and it belies, doesn't it, actually the way in which Christ was looking down and how he saw these scribes and Pharisees and what they were like are kind of rabid animals who are roaring, and this is not an easy thing for Christ, is it? And that kind of outward presentation is an example, isn't it? Is the example of someone who is conquering the flesh. But it's a psalm which goes on to to talk about the way in which this there will be salvation and how there is hope. And it's a suggestion made that the psalm, he has done this, that language is similar. I don't know enough to know whether this is the case. It's very similar to what Christ says when he says, it is finished before he dies. And the suggestion is that, does that suggest, in quoting the beginning and the end of the psalm, that Christ is thinking through this psalm? Well, clearly it's in his mind, isn't it, if he quotes it, and whether he, was actually kind of quoting it, and if whether, the last words that Christ spoke were what was this Psalm 22. It would be appropriate for him to do that. I don't think we can be kind of explicit about that. But here clearly is a man who is suffering, but is a man who is faithful until the end. And so we've seen, haven't we, through these interactions and with time gone, that they are very different. We have the soldiers that beat him. We have Simon that takes up the cross. We have the women that lament. We have the soldiers that crucify him. We have his mother and John, and there's other women that watch him. We have the priests that revile him, the thief that asks to be saved, the thief that kind of criticizes him, the centurion a little later that presides over his death and that kind of sees everything that happens and comes to the conclusion that he is the Son of God. We've got the other women and the disciples who are looking on. Eventually, we've got, Joseph that comes and requests the body, and we get Mary that stays and waits to see where Christ is laid. So we get all of these different interactions, don't we? And it's a whole spectrum of people that have a different level of understanding. Those that believe that he is special, that he is the Son of God. Those that believe he is just trouble. Those that come to understand in this moment, like the centurion and the thief, clearly had faith before, who he is and what he is offering. And as we said at the beginning, it kind of presents a question for all of us to answer, doesn't it? How we respond to our understanding of Christ. Thank you.